Karen snatched a Royal Guard's cross, tossed it to the ground, and raised her foot to crush it. But what happened next proved why faith stands unshaken. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow, at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards that you won't want to miss. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of history across Horse Guards Parade as Guard Thomas Matthews stood at his post with unwavering precision. His scarlet tunic caught the afternoon light, brass buttons gleaming with the same determination that had carried him through 2 tours in Afghanistan and earned him the Military Cross for valour under enemy fire. Beneath the perfect creases of his uniform, barely visible at the collar, a simple silver cross hung from a chain, a quiet testament to the faith that had sustained him through firefights and the loss of comrades. Not a statement, but a personal anchor. "Look at that!" came a sharp voice from beyond the ceremonial barrier. "A symbol of superstition on a Queen's Guard. How perfectly medieval." Karen Winters adjusted her designer glasses with manicured fingers, her expensive coat and precision-cut bob suggesting corporate success, the kind built on hard data and measurable outcomes. At 42, she'd made her reputation dismantling arguments rather than building consensus. Faith, to her analytical mind, was simply a hypothesis that failed every test of modern reason. "I'm curious about that cross," she called out, stepping closer to the barrier. "What exactly does it represent to you? Protection? Salvation?" Her tone carried the casual disdain of someone discussing debunked conspiracy theories. Because, scientifically speaking, silver around your neck provides neither. Matthews remained motionless, his training transforming his body into living statuary. The discipline that had once kept him motionless through sandstorms in Helmand Province now served him equally well on the parade grounds of London. "Men like you," Karen continued, addressing the guard as one might address a museum exhibit, "trained in modern warfare using satellite technology, ballistic science, still clinging to symbolic talismans from the Iron Age, the cognitive dissonance must be extraordinary." Nearby tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances, a mother quietly guiding her children away from the brewing confrontation. An elderly couple paused their photo-taking, the man's regimental tie suggesting military service. The small chaplain's cross pin on his lapel was subtle but unmistakable. "That's the problem with religion," Karen announced, her voice ensuring the gathering crowd became an unwilling audience. "It discourages critical thinking. It tells you to accept without evidence, to believe without proof." The elderly man whispered to his wife, 36 years as a military chaplain. I've seen that look before. The certainty that comes from never having been tested." "What's remarkable," Karen continued, oblivious, "is that you're not even allowed to respond, are you? Stuck there in silence, just like your God." Her smile was knife-sharp. "At least your silence makes sense, just following orders." "But divine silence, 2,000 years of unanswered prayers should be evidence enough for anyone with basic reasoning skills." Matthew's eyes remained fixed forward, but something almost imperceptible shifted in his bearing. Not a movement, but perhaps a gathering of inner strength, like a fortress quietly reinforcing its walls before an assault. The cross at his neck caught the light again, a small silver flash against scarlet. "Nothing to say?" Karen tapped her foot impatiently. "Of course not. Faith has no answers when confronted with reason. That's why it hides behind tradition, pageantry, and silence." "You must realize how absurd it all is," Karen continued, her voice rising with each word. "Carbon-dated evidence proves your Bible is historically inaccurate. Neuroscience has mapped the exact regions that create religious experiences. Even the so-called miracles have been debunked by basic physics." Matthews remained motionless, the embodiment of discipline. The silver cross at his collar caught the fading sunlight, gleaming against the red fabric. "I work with data," Karen announced to the uncomfortable audience. Facts, not feelings. And the data on religion is conclusive. It's a psychological coping mechanism, a security blanket for minds unable to face the randomness of existence. The former military chaplain cleared his throat. Ma'am, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue. Oh, I'm fully aware of his duty, Karen cut him off, standing perfectly still while thinking perfectly archaic thoughts. She turned back to Matthews. Does it make you feel special to believe some cosmic father figure is watching over you specifically? A university student stepped forward. Excuse me, but there's room for both science and faith. False equivalence, Karen snapped. That's compartmentalization, keeping rational thought and magical thinking in separate mental boxes. She gestured toward Matthews. He's the perfect example, trained in modern warfare but clinging to Bronze Age mythology. The crowd watched with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a car crash. A middle-aged couple edged away, muttering about ugly Americans, despite Karen's clearly British accent. The cross, Karen said, her attention fixing on the silver pendant, is the perfect symbol for religion's logical fallacy. You worship an instrument of execution because of a story with no historical evidence. She stepped closer to the barrier. It's like wearing a tiny electric chair around your neck and calling it salvation. The chaplain's wife tugged at her husband's sleeve. William, perhaps we should find a guard to intervene. They won't, Karen interjected, because deep down, everyone knows I'm right. She turned back to Matthews, frustration mounting at his continued stoicism. Your silence isn't dignity, it's intellectual surrender. Every second you stand there without defending that symbol proves how indefensible it really is. Matthews remained still, but those watching closely might have noticed his knuckles whitening slightly on his ceremonial rifle, not from anger, but from the invisible battle of self-control. Young lady, the chaplain said firmly, you're confusing professional discipline with inability to respond. His silence is not surrender, it's strength. Strength? Karen scoffed. There's nothing strong about intellectual cowardice, nothing brave about hiding behind tradition when your beliefs can't stand up to basic scientific scrutiny. She turned back to Matthews, her patience clearly fraying. I bet if I stood here advocating for your faith instead of questioning it, you'd find some way to acknowledge me, wouldn't you? A nod, a smile, but criticism gets nothing but this wall of silence. The tension in the air had become palpable, as Karen's frustration visibly mounted with each passing minute of Matthews's disciplined silence. Her carefully maintained composure had begun to crack around the edges, like expensive porcelain developing hairline fractures under pressure. This is exactly what's wrong with faith, she declared, her voice rising an octave. It has no answers, just dogma, no evidence, just tradition. She stepped even closer to the barrier, her designer boots now touching the rope. If your beliefs had any substance, any actual foundation in reality, you'd be able to defend them. But you can't, can you? The former chaplain took a half step forward, concern etched across his weathered features. Ma'am, I must insist. Oh, I'm sure you must, Karen cut him off with a dismissive wave. Another defender of the faith, ready to step in when reason becomes too uncomfortable. Her attention snapped back to Matthews, whose discipline remained unbroken despite the escalating confrontation. I'm talking to him, not you. I want to know why a man who's presumably seen the real world, war, suffering, death, would still cling to fairy tales about divine protection. The afternoon shadows had lengthened across Horse Guards Parade, but the gathering crowd showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, more tourists had stopped to witness the unfolding scene, their expressions ranging from discomfort to fascination. Tell me, Karen demanded, moving until the barrier rope pressed against her coat, when you were in combat, and I assume you were, given those medals, did you see any evidence of divine intervention? Did prayer stop any bullets? Did faith save any of your friends who died? Her words carried the deliberate precision of someone targeting vulnerabilities. Or did you just rationalize their deaths as God's plan to avoid facing the randomness of existence? Matthews remained motionless, but something changed in his eyes, a barely perceptible hardening, visible only to those who understood the cost of true discipline. The cross at his neck seemed to catch the fading light with particular brightness, drawing Karen's attention like a beacon. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper as she leaned forward. "That cross, it's not just regulation jewelry, is it? It's personal." Her eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just spied a key weakness in testimony. How fascinating! The stoic soldier has a security blanket, a little talisman to ward off the monsters. With calculated deliberation, she reached into her coat pocket and produced her phone. "I wonder what your commanding officer would think about this breach of uniform protocol. Perhaps I should document this violation and make a formal complaint." She held up her phone as if to take a photo, leaning precariously over the barrier. As she stretched forward, the silver cross caught her eye once more, glinting in the afternoon sun like a challenge to her world view. Something in Karen's expression shifted from confrontation to determination, her features hardening with sudden resolve. "You know what?" she announced, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I think it's time for a little empirical test of faith. Let's see if your God protects his symbols as much as you seem to think he protects you." In one fluid motion that startled nearby tourists, Karen lunged forward over the barrier, her manicured fingers grasping the silver chain at Matthews's neck. "Let's see how strong your faith really is when put to the test," she hissed, yanking the necklace with enough force to break the chain. There was a collective gasp from the crowd as the silver cross came away in her hand, the broken chain dangling between her fingers like a trophy. Matthews had not moved, his training holding him in place despite the personal violation, though a muscle twitched almost imperceptibly in his jaw. "Look, everyone!" Karen held the cross up high, her voice carrying across the parade ground. "The mighty soldier's charm, the magical protection that supposedly guards him." She turned the silver piece between her fingers, examining it with exaggerated curiosity. "Funny, it looks just like ordinary metal to me. No divine power, no special aura, just superstition given physical form." The former chaplain moved forward with surprising speed for his age. "Young woman, you've gone entirely too far. That's personal property and, personal property? Or evidence of institutional religious indoctrination?" Karen interrupted, stepping back from the barrier with the cross still clutched in her hand. "I'm simply exposing the contradiction at the heart of our supposedly secular military." Several phones had risen from the crowd, capturing the shocking moment despite the discomfort visible on their owners' faces. A security guard had finally noticed the disturbance and was making his way through the gathered tourists, but Karen seemed oblivious to everything except her captured prize and her captive audience. "This," she declared, dangling the cross from its broken chain, "is why we can't progress as a society. Because even our institutions of reason and order are infected with magical thinking." With deliberate contempt, she tossed the necklace toward the crowd, where it landed on the pavement with a small, sharp sound that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. "Faith deserves no special protection from criticism," Karen announced, stepping toward where the cross had fallen. "No immunity from reason, no shelter from evidence." Her boot hovered over the silver pendant, preparing to grind metal against stone. "If your God is real, let him stop me from—" What happened next occurred with such military precision that many in the crowd would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Matthews's ceremonial rifle was suddenly secured at his side, his white-gloved hand extending with controlled purpose. His boot swept outward in a precise, measured movement, not with violence but with calculated restraint, connecting with Karen's ankle just firmly enough to disrupt her balance without causing injury. She toppled sideways with an undignified yelp, landing on her hands and knees, while Matthews stepped forward in one fluid motion. With ceremonial precision, he bent and retrieved the silver cross from the pavement, before her descending boot could reach it. The movement was not hurried, but deliberate. The economy of motion that comes from years of military discipline. The crowd fell completely silent as Matthews straightened, the cross now cradled in his white-gloved palm. With solemn reverence, he raised the silver pendant to his lips, placing a kiss of devotion upon it, before securing it carefully in his breast pocket. For the first time since Karen had begun her tirade, Guard Thomas Matthews turned his full attention directly to her, his eyes carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced far greater threats than ideological confrontation. "Madam," Guard Matthews spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command despite its conversational volume. "I believe this conversation has progressed beyond words." The crowd remained frozen in collective shock, not just at Karen's actions, but at the guard's broken silence. His voice carried the unmistakable cadence of military precision, each word measured and purposeful. Karen scrambled to her feet, her expensive coat now smudged with dust from the parade ground. "So you can speak," she said, attempting to reclaim her composure with a dismissive hair flip. "Took physical assault on your superstitions to get a response. How telling." "What's telling?" Matthews replied, his posture returning to parade ground perfection, though his eyes remained fixed on Karen, "is that you believe attacking someone's faith requires attacking them physically." Not a trace of anger coloured his words, only the steady certainty of someone who had faced true conflict and found it quite different from the theatrical confrontations of civilian life. The former chaplain nodded in silent approval, his wife's hand clasped tightly in his. Around them, tourists had instinctively formed a wider circle, giving space to the confrontation while remaining riveted by its unexpected turn. "Your actions," Matthews continued, "crossed from ideological debate, which I respect even when I disagree, into physical violation, which I cannot permit." He adjusted his stance slightly. His ceremonial rifle returned to its proper position with fluid precision. "The cross you attempted to destroy isn't government property. It belonged to my brother." Something in his tone caused even Karen to momentarily falter, though she quickly recovered. "Your brother should grow up too, then. Imaginary friends are for children, not soldiers." "My brother," Matthews replied, his voice taking on a depth that silenced not just Karen, but the entire gathering, "died pulling 2 wounded civilians from a burning vehicle in Helmand Province. This cross was in his hand when we found him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch beyond the physical space of Horse Guards Parade, touching something deeper. Even the distant London traffic seemed momentarily hushed. "That may be sad," Karen said finally, though with noticeably less conviction, "but it doesn't make mythology into fact. Emotional attachment doesn't create truth." "You mistake me, madam," Matthews responded, his bearing reflecting years of standing firm under far worse fire than her arguments. "I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. Faith, by definition, is a choice. What I am suggesting is that you've mistaken certainty for truth, a common error on both sides of this debate." Security personnel had finally arrived at the perimeter, conferring quietly with the former chaplain, who appeared to be explaining the situation. Karen noticed them and straightened her posture, recognizing that her moment of confrontation was approaching its conclusion. "So, now comes the persecution," she announced to the crowd with theatrical martyrdom. "Silence the voice of reason. Protect religious sensibilities at all costs. This is exactly what I was talking about. Faith cannot withstand logical scrutiny, so it must be protected by force." "No one is silencing you, madam," Matthews replied, his calm unwavering. "You're facing consequences for attempting to destroy personal property and physically assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. Your words, however misguided I may find them, remain your right. A security officer approached Karen with professional detachment. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the ceremonial area, please." "Of course," Karen responded with exaggerated compliance. "Heaven forbid we disturb the sacred rituals with something as dangerous as critical thinking." But despite her sarcasm, she took a step back. Her earlier physical aggression visibly diminished in the face of official intervention. Matthews watched this exchange with the patient observation of a man accustomed to evaluating genuine threats. When he spoke again, his voice carried neither condemnation nor anger, only the measured consideration of someone who had weighed his words carefully. "Before you leave, madam," he said, "I believe I owe you the courtesy of addressing the questions you've been asking for the past 20 minutes. If you're genuinely interested in why a soldier might hold faith, rather than just seeking to demean that choice, I'm now at liberty to explain." Karen paused, caught between her desire to maintain her confrontational stance and genuine surprise at being addressed so directly. "Fine," she said finally, crossing her arms. "Enlighten me, soldier. Explain how a man of action embraces fairy tales." The security officer glanced at Matthews, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. 2 minutes, the officer said quietly, stepping back to maintain a watchful presence without interrupting. Matthews straightened, not with the ceremonial precision of his guard duties, but with the natural dignity of a man prepared to stand behind his convictions. "Then let me tell you about faith on the battlefield." "I didn't find God in a church," Matthews began, his voice carrying across the now silent parade ground. "I found him in a blood-soaked field hospital in Afghanistan, where I watched men with no hope left still choose courage. Where doctors worked 36-hour shifts because giving up meant death for others. Where love, not as an emotion, but as a choice to value others above yourself, was as tangible as the dust in the air." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her rehearsed arguments suddenly facing something beyond philosophical debate, lived experience delivered without apology or defensiveness. "Science explains how the world works," Matthews continued, "and I embrace that knowledge fully. My rifle operates according to physics. My tactical planning relies on mathematics. My communications function through electromagnetic principles." He touched his breast pocket where the silver cross now rested. "But science cannot tell me why the world is worth saving. Why a soldier throws himself on a grenade to save his comrades. Why we value truth over comfort, courage over safety, love over convenience." The former chaplain nodded slowly, his eyes bright with recognition of battles fought on multiple fronts. "You spoke of evidence," Matthews said, his posture relaxed yet dignified. "I've seen evidence you haven't. I've seen atheists pray in foxholes, not because fear overcame reason, but because human hearts instinctively reach beyond themselves when faced with their limitations. I've seen religious men question everything they believed while holding dying friends. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's the courage to live meaningfully within it." He gestured toward the silver cross in his pocket. "This symbol doesn't represent blind certainty to me. It represents the mystery at the heart of our existence, that love persists in a universe of entropy, that meaning emerges from apparent randomness, that consciousness itself arises in a cosmos of matter and energy." Karen's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly from contempt to something more complex. "That's all very poetic," she said, though the edge had dulled in her voice. "But it doesn't address the logical contradictions in religious belief." "Perhaps," Matthews acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head, "because human existence itself contains apparent contradictions. We are biological organisms driven by evolutionary imperatives, yet we write poetry and sacrifice ourselves for abstract principles. We are bound by physical laws, yet we imagine transcendence and create art that serves no survival purpose." He glanced briefly at the gathered crowd, not performing for them, but acknowledging their presence in this unexpected moment of public testimony. "My faith doesn't ignore science. It begins where science reaches its limits. The question how belongs to science. The question why belongs to philosophy, art, and yes, faith. Matthews's voice remained measured, neither defensive nor aggressive. When I hold this cross, I'm not denying reason. I'm acknowledging that reason alone cannot explain the fullness of human experience. A young woman in the crowd nodded almost unconsciously, while nearby a university student with an atheist society pin listened with unexpected attention. In combat, Matthews continued, I've been forced to confront questions most people can comfortably avoid their entire lives. Why this person died while that one lived? Why suffering falls unevenly across humanity? Why beauty persists alongside horror? My faith doesn't provide easy answers to these questions. It provides a framework for living meaningfully within them. He touched his breast pocket again, a gesture of connection rather than defensiveness. This cross belonged to my brother James. He was a combat medic who died saving others. His faith didn't make him passive or delusional. It made him more fully present to reality, more capable of courage, more committed to serving others at any cost. The security officer checked his watch discreetly, but made no move to interrupt. Even Karen stood in uncharacteristic silence, her prepared counter-arguments seemingly inadequate against the lived testimony before her. You called faith a coping mechanism, Matthews said, and perhaps there's truth in that. But we all have mechanisms for facing the vastness and complexity of existence. Some turn to pure reason, some to art, some to service, some to faith, many to some combination of all these. The question isn't whether we need frameworks for meaning, but whether those frameworks enable us to live with greater courage, compassion, and honesty. A soft autumn breeze moved across the parade ground, rustling fallen leaves across the ancient stones. Matthews stood perfectly straight, not with ceremonial rigidity, but with the natural dignity of a man at peace with his convictions. I don't expect to have converted you, madam, he concluded, nor was that my intention. Faith by coercion isn't faith at all, but perhaps I've demonstrated that faith can coexist with reason, that it need not be blind adherence to dogma, but can be a courageous embracing of mystery alongside knowledge. His eyes met Karen's directly, neither challenging nor pleading. The cross I wear honours my brother's sacrifice and reminds me daily that love persists even in death. You may see it as superstition. I see it as the most profound reality I've encountered. The security officer stepped forward. Ma'am, I need you to come with me. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is a serious offence. It's personal property, actually, Matthews corrected quietly, though the assault charges remain valid. Karen's face flushed with indignation. This is exactly what happens when you question religion. The machinery of the state steps in to protect it from scrutiny. No, ma'am, the security officer replied. This is what happens when you physically assault someone and attempt to destroy their property. Your opinions on religion are irrelevant to the charges. The former chaplain stepped forward. Young woman, no one is restricting your freedom to express opinions. You crossed the line when you chose to express those opinions through physical assault. Semantics, Karen scoffed, though with noticeably less conviction. The message, Matthews said as he prepared to return to his post, is that respect for others' beliefs doesn't require sharing them. My faith doesn't demand your agreement, only your basic courtesy. The same courtesy I would extend to your lack of faith. Will you be pressing charges? The security officer asked. Matthews shook his head. I believe the lady has faced sufficient consequences. Sometimes understanding comes through reflection rather than punishment. He touched the silver cross briefly before returning to his ceremonial stance. Karen's expression flickered between relief and confusion at this unexpected mercy. Don't think this changes anything, she said, though the words lacked their earlier venom. That is your right, Matthews replied simply, just as holding faith is mine. As security guided Karen away, the former chaplain approached. "Thank you, son," he said quietly, "not just for defending your faith, but for demonstrating its true nature, strength with mercy, conviction without cruelty." Matthews acknowledged him with only the slightest inclination of his head. The chaplain nodded understanding, his own military background recognizing the return to duty. Nearby, a young mother explained to her curious daughter, "The lady was very angry and did something unkind. The guard protected something precious to him, but he wasn't cruel about it." "Like when Tommy broke my bracelet but I didn't hit him back?" the child asked. "Exactly like that, love," her mother replied, glancing at Matthews with newfound respect. As the afternoon sun cast longer shadows, regular tourism slowly resumed. Yet something had shifted in how visitors regarded the scarlet-coated figure. They saw now not merely a tourist attraction, but a human being whose disciplined exterior contained depths of thought, experience, and conviction. The silver cross, now safely tucked in Matthews's pocket, carried new significance. Damaged but intact, it had become not just a memorial to his fallen brother, but a testament to faith's resilience when faced with direct assault. A young couple lingered by the barrier. There was something about how he defended his faith, not with anger, but with this quiet certainty, the woman observed. "It makes me want to understand more, not less." Matthews maintained his watch. To outward appearances, nothing had changed. Yet within, the confrontation had affirmed rather than shaken his convictions, not because he had won an argument, but because he had articulated what he believed in the face of genuine challenge. The cross that had been his private anchor was now a public testament, not to blind faith or unthinking tradition, but to love that persists beyond death, to meaning that transcends chaos, to the mystery at the heart of a soldier's service. What would you have done in Guard Matthews's position? When your deepest beliefs are not just questioned but physically attacked, is measured response still possible? And if you found value in this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. Press that bell icon to receive notifications when we post more stories about the Royal Guards, who stand as living symbols of dedication, discipline, and duty. Share this video with someone who might appreciate a thoughtful exploration of faith in the modern world, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to defend your deepest beliefs against hostile criticism? How did you respond? Did you maintain the same dignity Guard Matthews displayed? Or did emotion overcome principle? Do check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now to discover more inspiring stories of honour and service. And we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video.